After his defeat in the 2010 World Championship match, Sicillian Topalov struggled to regain his form, but it looks like he's back. He's just had an emphatic victory in the FIDE Grand Prix tournament in Zug, winning with 8 out of 11, a point and a half clear of Nakamura in second place. I'd like to look at Topalov's penultimate game against Caruana, and well, let's have a look. Topalov was black, and he played the Najdorf variation with the black pieces, one of my favourite openings. And Caruana played the so-called English attack with bishop e3. And I'm very pleased to see that Topalov actually played one of my recommendations from my recent DVD that I brought out a couple of months ago. So let's have a look at this. Bishop e7, all very standard so far. And here, if black wants to, you can play with knight d7 or b5. And this has been played many times, and perhaps this is playable for black. But I think in practice, this is much easier for white to play than for black, because basically white is just storming down the board with G and H pawns here. And of course, black has counterplay, but yeah, much easier for white to play than black. But Topalov played a5. This is the move that I recommended on my DVD. I'm sure Topalov wasn't following my recommendation. This has been a pretty common move in top-level chess for some years now. I really like this move because what black is doing is starting his queenside counterplay very early, before white has a chance to gain the initiative on the king side. So the idea is very simple. You want to try to push this knight out of the way. Of course, if it has to go back into the corner, that's pretty terrible anyway, and then maybe push on with a3. So white has to react straight away. Now, probably the most common move here is to play bishop b5, stopping that pawn, and then, well, you can play knight d7 and knight b6, or maybe knight a6 and knight c7. But Caruana played a4 just to block that pawn and take control over the b5 square. Okay, it's also one of the main moves. Now, there is a disadvantage to playing with a4, and that's that it weakens this b4 square. And Topalov played knight a6. Good move. In fact, the knight is looking at b4, but there's another point to playing this move. I mean, if g4, then I think black would play knight b4, and the knight sits rather menacingly there on the queen side, and perhaps you can try and get in d5 as well. But Caruana played bishop b5, just kind of solidifying his control over the queen side. And now knight b4 is possible, but Topalov played knight c7, just trying to shake white's grip over the queen side. Now bishop b6, I think this is a good move. You have to stop knight b5. Now queen c8, again knight b5 is threatened. Now what black is praying for is if white gets very greedy and starts to take pawns on the queen side, because this just opens up lines. So for example here, I think black is already doing extremely well. If the bishop goes back, then d5, the classic Najdorf break. And with these open files here and the center opening up, black has a tremendous attack here. Let's just go back. You'll notice in that position how white's queenside counterplay is white's kingside counterplay is nowhere, is non-existent. So Caruana played, I think, correctly and took the knight off, exchanged off the knight, so leaving himself with this pretty good grip over the queenside. So black's queenside attack really isn't happening at the moment. However, on the plus side, he's managed to get white to exchange off this very important dark squared bishop, which means it's much harder for white to attack on the king side. Okay, well finally white started the kingside attack. Now black needs play. It's not happening on the queen side, so he played rook d8, looking to play d5, the classic Najdorf break. And if white hangs around, then d5 will come and black has no problems. He has the two bishops. Things are going well. So I think white has to push on. But you can see without that dark squared bishop, this knight finds a beautiful square on f4, and this is going to be white's problem for the entire game, actually. So black would still like to play the knight into f4 and push with d5. Therefore, I think white's next move is, well, almost forced, and black has to exchange off this knight. Now, queen takes is impossible because of bishop takes, pawn check. So white has to play pawn takes. I think those last moves, I mean, really that was a very logical sequence of moves from both players. And we've ended up, the position is settled, the pawn structure's changed, and this is a very typical structure for the Najdorf. You can reach it from many different variations, where white has managed to land this piece on d5, recapture with the e-pawn, and has this queenside pawn majority, and black has pawn majority on the other side of the board. White has control over the queen side, but strangely, black has control over the king side. Normally it's the other way round in this variation. Now let's see how things develop. Well, it's difficult for white to push his queenside pawn majority. He just has to wait for the moment, actually. And here you could say that the normal way to play for black would be to sink the knight on f4 and play f6. Now, why didn't Topalov play like this? Well, I think maybe because he could see this knight coming into e4. It's a nice square for the knight. Now, of course, he has play against the h-pawn, and this is a superb piece. But his king is, after the f-pawn is advanced, a little bit exposed. His pawn structure isn't brilliant. It's okay. But I think it's mainly to do with his king. But, okay, this is a playable position for black. Playable for both sides, I think. Let's go back. But Topalov didn't play like that. He selected a far more ambitious continuation. He played queen d8. Okay, the knight comes to this beautiful square on f4, thanks to forcing the exchange of this dark squared bishop much earlier on. And now he didn't play with f6, he played h6. Now this is very ambitious indeed. Now I don't think it's not really possible for white to hang on to that pawn, leave the pawn on g5. It's going to be too weak. He played knight d2. Now he's basically begging black to take this pawn, because, well, here white's attack is just absolutely crushing. Black will not survive this position. For example, here white is breaking through, the bishop's going to come back to d3, it's going to be all over. So here Topalov waited. Now basically he's going to switch his rook to the h-file and then take on g5, and then, yeah, should win a pawn. So at this point Caruana has to exchange. So it's a little bit risky to have the king come up the board like this, but you can see the difference between this position and the last one, where black broke with f6, that here black's pawns are together, and by playing the pawn to f5 he's going to be able to control that e4 square. So positionally this is sounder for black, but his king is a little bit exposed just for the time being. Let's see how things developed. Knight c4. Now maybe knight e4 was better there, but, well, knight c4 is not bad. Okay, it's a very long game. I'm going to get to the next critical moment. Here's the next critical moment. Caruana is trying to break open the king side. Now, if this is taken, you can see how these open lines are just potentially fatal. Here's a nice couple of variations. Queen e4, rook takes knight is threatened. And if f5, I'm afraid that doesn't work. There's still a mate on the h-file. And here, if f5, this is a beautiful move. Now this basically makes room for the queen, and suddenly rook takes knight is threatened, and it's all over for black. let's go back. So knight h5, not good. G takes h5. Oh, that just looks too risky to me, splitting up the pawns, opening up the king. You know, maybe rook d4 here and sacrifice. Maybe knight b6 and try to bring the bishop back. Don't like this for black. Topalov played g5, trying to keep the position closed. Okay, Caruana still trying to find a way through. f5. Okay, so positionally, very nice from black's viewpoint. If he could exchange queens here, he'd be doing pretty well. But there's an attack here. Okay, let's just move on to the next critical moment. I think these moves are pretty sound from both players. Now here, I think Caruana made a blunder. He moved his knight back to the queen side. I think he had to play knight g2. And this is a very tricky position indeed. Probably the soundest continuation for black is just to exchange. And, well, don't take on h6, not yet. I think this gives white good chances to break through. For example, f4, this is a very annoying move. And bring the bishop back. And I think f5 is going to fall here. And this is very dangerous indeed. But if black plays more carefully, let's say bishop d8, and now brings the queen to d7 to protect f5, and with a bit of luck, maybe brings the bishop here. Now, I think it's going to be very difficult for black to make progress, but I'd say the chances are about equal here. Okay, let's go back. So I think knight g2 was best to get rid of this fantastic piece on f4. But after knight c4, Topalov began to take control. Let's have a look. Now, yeah, with this beautiful knight on f4, it's going to be possible to take on h6. And Caruana's trying to create some play on the queen side, but it's just not happening. And after the exchange of rooks, Topalov is getting closer to a really favourable endgame. And basically, yeah, he's got control here. So let's just go a little bit further on. Now he even managed to exchange queens here. And now I think basically white is lost. Because this kingside pawn majority is going to just be forced through. So black just needs to build up nice and steadily. G4 was played here. I think this is a winning move. E4 was also good. But G4 here, well, it's been suggested that perhaps knight f5 was a better move, but I think black is winning this endgame as well. But this is probably white's best chance to play like this. But I think that black can win this ending. Okay, let's go back. So let's just go through to the end of the game. Here, really, there's nothing to stop these pawns advancing. And here, after bishop b6, Caruana resigned. So finally, this so-called bad bishop reaches this wonderful diagonal. This is actually such a common maneuver in the Najdorf, bringing this bishop over to b6, and it rakes down across the king side. And here, well, the pawns just go through. For example, here, and the king comes in, and e3 and f2, f1, it's all over. This kind of scenario where there's a deep strategic battle from the opening is, in my experience, the most common outcome from the Najdorf variation. I think a lot of people fear a kind of sacrificial attack that white has in the opening. In my experience, that doesn't happen very often. More often, black wins through with his positional trumps, in this case, a strong kingside pawn majority. But a really brave game from Topalov, a very ambitiously played game, keeping his positional trumps, this beautiful kingside pawn structure, and surviving white's tricks, and finally winning through in the endgame. That is the most common scenario in the Najdorf. If you're interested to learn more about this fantastic opening, then do check out my DVD, the Najdorf, a practical repertoire for black, available from the Chess Base shop to download. Thanks very much for watching.